The idea of sea creatures, or monsters in the ocean, has been a common trend amongst almost all ancient civilizations, particularly those that lived close to the water. The ocean itself would certainly have been a mystery, an endless stretch of water, teeming with life, and yet so full of dangers and compelling intrigues. Why, even when the oceans were being fed by the early Greeks and Romans, the mystery of the sea would only begin to grow as one could not know what lurked in the shadows below. The discoveries and sightings of aquatic life would only fuel the belief in savage sea monsters, and before long, many would misinterpret that which they saw, spawning rumours and false accounts that at the time would be taken as words of caution. The ocean remains to be a place of frightful elusiveness, and perhaps just the place that may have once been the home of the devastating biblical monster known as Leviathan. The Leviathan appears in the Old Testament and is a popular creature and metaphor amongst the people of the Christian and Jewish faiths. It is thought to be a representation of God's power, given the sheer size of the beast, as well as a demonic being, a monster that plagues the waters alongside its monster buddies, the behemoth, who terrorizes the land, and the Ziz, who is associated with the air. We see Leviathan appear a total of 6 times, once in Isaiah, twice in Psalms, and twice in the book of Job. We first see it mentioned in the book of Job after God has killed Job's children, ruined his crops and his livelihood, and allowed the devil to curse Job with sores upon his body. This comes about as a wager between God and the devil, who argues that Job is only loyal to God because God treats him with all that he has. God believes, however, that even if he took everything away from Job, Job would still worship him. By the 3rd chapter, Job is on the verge of giving up. Even his wife tells him to forget about God and to go ahead and die. Job recites to cursing his own day of birth, wishing he'd never been born, and encourages everyone else in a monologue to do the same. In 3:8, he tells us, "May those who curse days curse that day, those who are ready to rouse Leviathan." What Job means by this is that he wants everyone to curse the day he was born, regardless of who they are. He wants them to share his pain almost, and even includes those who are reckless and mad enough to rouse Leviathan. He wants even the craziest, most diabolical, most foolish people, the sort that would even think about rousing Leviathan, to curse his day of birth, as if their curses would hold even more weight. What's interesting here is that by this, Job is seemingly aware of Leviathan and what it is capable of, given that he recognizes that those who would intentionally awaken it would be mad and of ill sense. After a few days of lamenting, Job's bitterness is unleashed. He cannot understand why God has done this and pretty much has a long go at him. God replies to Job, however, though doesn't mention that he had a wager with the devil and that Job was the unfortunate focus of the bet, but instead tells Job he is just a mortal and so cannot understand. He tells him about all of the duties he has as God, how he maintains the world and provides an adequate ecosystem for all living things. He patronizes Job into oblivion, but not before he brings up Leviathan, which the entirety of chapter 41 of the book of Job is dedicated to. He says, "Can you pull in Leviathan with a fish hook, or tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose, or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it keep begging you for mercy? Will it speak to you with gentle words? Will it make an agreement with you for you to take it as your slave for life? Can you make a pet of it like a bird, or put it on a leash for the young woman in your house? Will traders barter for it? Will they divide it up among the merchants? Can you fill its hide with harpoons, or its head with fishing spears? If you lay a hand on it, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Any hope of subduing it is false. The mere sight of it is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven belongs to me. I will not fail to speak of Leviathan's limbs, its strength and its graceful form. Who can strip off its outer coat? Who can penetrate its double coat of armour? Who dares open the doors of its mouth, ringed about with fearsome teeth? Its back has rows of shields, tightly sealed together. Each is so close to the next that no air can pass between. They are joined fast to one another. They cling together and cannot be parted. Its snorting throws out flashes of light. Its eyes are like the rays of dawn. Flames stream from its mouth. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke pours from its nostrils, as from a boiling pot over burning reeds. Its breath sets coals ablaze, and flames dart from its mouth. Strength resides in its neck. Dismay goes before it. The folds of its flesh are tightly joined. They are firm and immovable. Its chest is as hard as rock, hard as a lower millstone. When it rises up, the mighty are terrified. They retreat before its thrashing. The sword that reaches it has no effect, nor does the spear, or the dart, or the javelin. Iron it treats like straw, and bronze like rotten wood. Arrows do not make it flee. Sling stones are like chaff to it. A club seems to it but a piece of straw. It laughs at the rattling of the lance. Its undersides are jagged potsherds, leaving a trail in the mud like a threshing sledge. It makes the depths churn like a boiling cauldron, and stirs up the sea like a pot of ointment. It leaves a glistening wake behind it. One would think the deep had white hair. Nothing on earth is its equal, a creature without fear. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud. So as you can see, God pretty much schools Job on the Leviathan. He reveals the chasm-like gap between their intellects by detailing the greatness of Leviathan and how incredibly intricate its physiology is. He is basically telling Job that he is stepping out of line by even questioning him, that he has the means to make something so immense while Job does not. He essentially uses Leviathan to remind Job to stay in his lane and not to think he knows everything when evidently he does not and cannot hope to. The passage is also great in giving us a description of Leviathan and helps us to shape our own idea on what this creature is and how powerful it really is. Leviathan is also mentioned in Isaiah 27, where Isaiah tells us about the deliverance of Israel and what God's judgment will look like during this time. The chapter begins by detailing the fate of Leviathan, where Isaiah tells us that on this very day of Israel's deliverance, the Lord with his sword, his fierce, great and powerful sword, Leviathan, the gliding serpent, Leviathan, the coiling serpent, he will slay the monster of the sea. By this, it is thought that Leviathan is an evil entity, and that by slaying it, God is bringing salvation on mankind by ridding them of a creature that may have terrified them so. In his delivering of Israel, he is ridding the world of a menace in Leviathan, and further reinforces the belief that if one follows a righteous path, God will reward them in some manner. The killing of Leviathan is not only a show of God's strength, but also symbolic of a creator who wants the best for his creations, and is willing to erase the perils he has put in place for them should they show him loyalty. In essence, the destruction of Leviathan can be seen as God's mercy. Psalm 74, titled A Contemplation of Asaph, also mentions Leviathan, but gives it a slightly different description. The psalm is thought to be a sorrowful prayer to God after the destruction of a temple by the Babylonians, in which Asaph is asking God why had they been forsaken, and why had the temple been allowed to be destroyed. God is also asked how long he intends to remain silent on the matter, for the enemies mock him, despite all that he has done. Asaph reminds God that it was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. And through this, Asaph shows God that if he can do something as bold as slaying Leviathan, then he should not be so coy in slaying those who destroyed the temple. Interestingly, we see Leviathan described as having heads, plural, and this only serves to make the monster seem even more terrifying. It also shows us the depths of God's creativity to make something so ghastly, but also the power of God that he is able to crush those very heads. Leviathan is then used as a nourishment for the creatures of the desert, and some believe that by this, A'seth means the most righteous, in that those who are the most loyal are rewarded with the flesh of the Leviathan to consume. This actually links with the mention of the Leviathan in the apocryphal book of Enoch, which also states that Leviathan will be served as food. Chapter 58 of Enoch is dedicated to describing the destruction that Enoch sees in the vision, and that he tells us, "In that day shall be distributed for food 2 monsters, a female monster whose name is Leviathan, dwelling in the depths of the sea, above the springs of waters, and a male monster whose name is Behemoth, which possesses, moving on his breast, the invisible wilderness." Here we see a gender assigned to Leviathan, in that it is female, something that isn't apparent in the description by God to Job, or in the Psalms. It might seem inconsequential as to what gender the Leviathan is, but if it was a female, then it might have been created by God with the intention of having it reproduce. Such an idea also comes across in a Midrash, where it's believed God created both a male and female Leviathan, but that he feared the 2 monsters would procreate, and that their species would hunt everything else into extinction. So God killed the female, and once again, its flesh would be used to feed the righteous on the advent of the Messiah. Furthermore, a Jewish hymn, sung at the festival of Shavuot, that celebrates the giving of the Torah, known as Akdamot, contains a section that tells us more about the use of Leviathan's flesh. We are told that Leviathan locks horns with Behemoth, and that the two engage in a fight before God intervenes and kills them both with his sword. The skin of Leviathan is described as beautiful, and it is used as a canopy to shelter the righteous, who will dine on its flesh, as well as the behemoths. Psalm 104, meanwhile, is a text dedicated to praising the greatness of God, and paints Leviathan in a slightly different light. It reads, "How many are your works, Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. There the ships go to and fro, and Leviathan, which you formed to frolic there." It almost sounds as if Leviathan is being spoken about favourably here. In a passage that speaks about praising God's works, it's interesting that Leviathan, a scary monster, should be mentioned at all. By stating that it frolics where ships are, makes it sound that the monster coexists with those faring the seas, and even makes it sound playful. This might link with the belief that Leviathan, though a monstrous looking being, is actually God's pet, and that God plays with the beast, the way one might play with a kitten. Similarly, there is a mention of Leviathan in the Jewish Talmud, where it's said that there are 12 hours in a day. God sits and learns the Torah. The second 3 hours, he sits and judges the world. The third 3 hours, God feeds the entire world. The fourth 3-hour period, God plays with the Leviathan. Another interpretation of Leviathan, though, is that the beast is either a demon or very simply a sea monster that is influenced or in some way controlled by Satan. Meanwhile, some interpreters see Leviathan as a metaphor for the rebelling of mankind against God, and that Leviathan is so large a creature because it represents man's sin. The fact that God usually destroys Leviathan supports the idea that eventually, those who go against God will be met with extreme punishment, usually total destruction, or the crushing of heads, as Psalm 74 tells us. The term Leviathan is thought to have meant twisted coil in Old Hebrew, and this may attest to the idea that Leviathan was a snake-like creature, or a sea serpent. This is echoed by the Greeks, for when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, the term Leviathan meant dragon. Alternatively, modern Hebrew sees Leviathan mean whale, again another beast associated with the water, albeit a more corporeal and less exciting one. Since then, Leviathan has also thought to have been a very large crocodile, which may attribute to its scaly flesh. Still, across all translations, it is agreed that Leviathan is a large creature, one that has a dominant presence in the water, and something that would certainly be a testament to God's creative ability. But of course, the descriptions of the creature change across translations, cultures, and general beliefs, what with some seeing it as a serpent and others seeing it as a whale. The whale variation is thought to show the creature to be larger than the biggest whale, and to come with a cylindrical body and fins, conforming to a more realistic and earthly expectation. Meanwhile, the serpent or dragon variations are far more ambitious, and shows the beast to be covered in a scaly armour-like flesh, rows of sharp teeth, and the uncanny ability to shoot blasts of molten hot fire. While the exact origin of Leviathan is unknown, though most point to the Book of Job, it's thought that the basis of the creature may have come from the Canaanite god Baal, who had a battle with a seven-headed monster known as Lotan. But there is no clear-cut correlation between Lotan and Leviathan, especially given that no one in the Bible tries to fight the beast, and who could blame them? Others see Leviathan as a metaphor for the sea itself, in that the sea is massive, making up most of the earth. It is also a dangerous beast if you think about it. Uncontrollable waves that move freely, that can sink vessels and drown men all in a matter of minutes. The sea itself is just as terrifying as Leviathan, for mankind cannot hope to ever control it, defeat it, or even really understand it. Another interesting interpretation appears from scholars who believe that Leviathan was a metaphor for pirates who at the time would prey on merchant vessels in the Kingdom of Israel. They would kill crews and steal that which they wanted. Much like the biblical beast, these seafaring rogues were hard to pin down, and perhaps the scale that they were operating on may have made sailors feel like these marauders were everywhere, and far larger in size. It's hard to really comprehend the sheer scale of Leviathan, let alone consider the sheer destructiveness of such a monster. It's fair to say that if such a thing existed in our time, we would have no doubt known about it by now. But there are those who wonder what exactly lurks at the bottom of the ocean, and whether there could be something Leviathan-esque lurking down there, waiting to submerge. But let me know what you thought about Leviathan, and what your take on this biblical monster is. Do you believe it once existed, or do you think it's still with us? Perhaps you see it from a metaphorical point of view, see it as a symbol for man's increasing defiance of the biblical God, or maybe as a metaphor for the danger of the sea itself.
Hello and welcome back everyone. We've seen a lot of colossal mythical creatures so far, but nothing compares to what we're about to explore today. The behemoth is a massive monster found in the religious beliefs and traditions of the Hebrew, Christian, and Muslim faiths. The mythical creature is described both in the Hebraic books of Enoch and Job. He was presented as a male counterpart of the female Leviathan, a massive sea creature that we will explore eventually as well. In the book of Job, the behemoth was brought forth to demonstrate the futility of questioning God's power and decisions. After all, He created these apocalyptic beings Himself. It is said that the behemoth dwells in a desert east of the Garden of Eden, and as a creature as old as time itself, its proportion and strength were something out of this world, something unthinkable to the human mind. It is said that the beast is so enormous that a vast desert extended on its upper body. Its bones were made out of brass, and according to the myth, it could consume thousands of acres of vegetation through its massive mouth and swallow the river Jordan in one single gulp. His physical description varies a lot. Some say that he looked like an elephant, others describe him as a hippo, a rhinoceros, or a bull, and sometimes as a mix of all these animals. In Jewish tradition, there's a prophecy describing the coming of the Judgment Day and the Messiah. In that moment, the behemoth and the Leviathan will be locked in a battle to the death. The bodies of the fallen beasts will be served as the food for the chosen ones who live their lives in righteousness. In European medieval Christian traditions, the behemoth was vastly portrayed as an incredibly powerful natural force in the form of an elephant with an expanded belly. That imagery was used to describe the delights of the belly, and the devil's temptation on humans, trying to force them onto the vice of overindulgence. In Muslim traditions, the behemoth is a counterpart of the Bahamut, the vast monster that supports the earth on a cosmic level. In the mythology associated with Islam, the Bahamut was created to support a gigantic bull, which in turn supported a giant ruby on which stood an angel holding 6 hells, above which was the earth and its 7 heavens. In the tales of the 1001 Nights, we're told that Isa, or Jesus, was the only one that was ever granted the privilege of admiring Bahamut in all its magnitude and presence.
Perhaps a staple of all world mythologies is the presence of extraordinary and strange beasts. From the Minotaur and Cyclops of Greek myth, to the many bizarre yokai of Japanese folklore. But what about the Bible? In this video, let's take a look at 4 unusual creatures found in the Old Testament and examine where academics believe these strange beasts may have come from. Unicorns. Okay, this should be familiar territory. Horses with horns. We all know what unicorns look like. Surprisingly, they're actually mentioned quite a few times in the Bible. In the book of Numbers, it describes God as being like a unicorn. God brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. Another example is in the book of Job, where God rhetorically asks, "Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide by thy crib?" Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, you'll know that a great place to start is looking at the original language. In Hebrew, they're not called unicorns. Instead, they're simply called re'em. Remember this word, re'em. We'll come back to it in a second. When the Greeks began translating the Bible, they translated this Hebrew word, re'em, to monokeros, which simply means one horn. Similarly, Latin speakers translated the word as unicornis, from which we get our word, unicorn. Speaking of Greeks and Romans, strangely, unicorns do not feature in their mythologies. Instead, they are featured in ancient Greco-Roman natural encyclopedias, basically ancient textbooks on nature. This is all to say that people did not think unicorns were mythical beasts, but actually real-life creatures, as real as a cow, lion, or horse. Why? Well, it's a case of mistaken identity. This one-horned creature is actually a rhino. When early travellers went to faraway lands, they spoke of strange creatures they saw on their way. One was called a unicorn. For example, Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder offers his description of a unicorn as a very fierce animal called the unicorn, which has the head of a stag, the feet of an elephant, and the tail of a boar, while the rest of the body is like that of a horse. Scholars believe that Pliny is offering an imperfect description of a rhino. It is likely that he heard a second-hand or even third-hand description of one, and is recounting it in this book. The description of a rhino became distorted with each telling, a bit like a game of telephone. So, returning back to the Bible and unicorns, we can see how the original description of a rhino may have been distorted when it first got translated. Remember the Hebrew word for unicorn, re'em? Well, it doesn't mean rhino, but a creature rather similar. The re'em has now been identified as an animal the nearby Akkadians called the rimu. Today, we'd call it an aurochs, an ancient ancestor of modern-day cattle. So, when the Bible talks about unicorns and so on, it's actually referring to an ancient type of bull. So now, it's a case of a triple mistaken identity. Originally, the Bible described a bull, which was then misinterpreted as a unicorn, which itself was a misinterpretation of a rhino. A bit convoluted, but hey. Okay, next beast. Leviathan and Behemoth. These are perhaps the most famous mythical creatures in the whole Bible, ones you may be familiar with. The Behemoth and Leviathan appear in the book of Job. As part of a wider speech, God offers an extensive description of each creature. Let's start with the Behemoth. It's a gigantic land creature of immense strength. Here's the full description. Behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. His sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword. For the mountains yield food for him, where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plants he lies, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade the lotus trees cover him, the willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he is not frightened. He is confident, though Jordan rushes against his mouth. Can one take him by his eyes, or pierce his nose with a snare? Now just after this description comes the Leviathan. This creature is a giant sea monster, serpentine, scaly, and very ferocious. The description is a bit longer than behemoths, so I won't read out in full, only some select verses, so you get the picture. His back is made of rows of shields, shut up closely as with a seal. One is so near the other, so that no air can come between them. Out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth. Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or head with fishing spears? Lay your hands on him, remember the battle, you will not do it again. So some scholars have tried the same tactic applied with a unicorn, finding a real-life counterpart to match these descriptions. Let's start with a behemoth, a large land animal that eats grass like an ox and is known for its incredible strength, but mostly just relaxes in shaded waters. If you guessed a hippo, you'd be right. Okay, how about a leviathan? An aquatic reptile that has tough scaly skin and rows of sharp teeth. Did you think of a crocodile? So, potentially, God is not describing two mythical beasts, but simply two real-life animals, just with a bit of pizzazz. At one point in time, this view was really popular amongst scholars, but it's had its problems over the years. Mostly with the Leviathan, how do we account for the creature's fiery breath, or its serpentine appearance? Plus, the Leviathan lives in the depths of the seas, whereas crocodiles typically live in fresh water. Another popular theory hopes to offer a better explanation. These are not descriptions of real animals, but instead really are descriptions of mythical beasts with great power. See, the Leviathan has a bit of a history with this one. In a bunch of myths across the world, especially creation myths, there's a trope of gods doing battles with sea monsters just like the Leviathan. The Germans called it the Chaoskampf, or primordial battle. For example, in the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, the chief god Marduk defeats the sea beast Tiamat and creates the land, sea and sky with her dismembered body. A very similar story comes from an ancient Canaanite myth in which the sea beast Lotan is slayed by the chief god Baal at the start of creation. In fact, the name Lotan is generally believed to be where we get the name Leviathan in the first place. The Chaoskampf appears more than just the Middle East. The Norse god Thor battles with the world serpent Jormungandr. The Greek god Zeus slays the serpentine Typhon. The Hindu deity Indra defeats the aquatic snake demon Vitra. And even as far as Japan, we have the Shinto storm god Susanoo, who slays the 8-headed sea serpent Yamato no Orochi. So out of this we get the idea of the Leviathan, this primordial sea snake of creation. But note that in the book of Job, God's not doing battle with the Leviathan. Instead, he's celebrating its majesty, and it all seems to invert the trope on its head. Oh, and the counterpart Behemoth? Sadly, it's not really well known where it comes from. Some say it's a giant mythical cow. After all, its name, Behemoth, is related to the Hebrew word for cattle, behemah. With this, they suspect that it could be related to a giant bull in the Epic of Gilgamesh that was sent down from heaven to do battle with the heroes, Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Who knows? The jury's out on this one. Perhaps the Behemoth is some sort of other creature that only ever appears here in this part of the Bible, and nowhere else. The Nephilim. Final creatures for now, the Nephilim, literally translating to the fallen ones, but often just called the giants. I touched on them in a video about the origins of Lucifer, but to summarise, the Nephilim are said to be the offspring of a forbidden procreation between angels and the humans. This story is expounded on at length in the apocryphal Book of Enoch, where they cause havoc and generally just cause a bit of a mess. Now, that's an apocryphal account, and not in the mainstream Bible canon. So if we limit it just to the Bible, there isn't really much about them. In Genesis, they are said to be warriors of renown. and in the book of Numbers, the Israelites describe themselves as being the size of grasshoppers in comparison to them. The real debate is whether we take it literally or if they're just being emphatic. Maybe these are just exaggerated descriptions of real-life warriors. Well, the Book of Enoch takes it literally, and even goes a step further, measuring the Nephilim at a whopping 1.35 kilometers, that's 4,500 feet tall. But who knows? The Book of Enoch is just one of many interpretations. A clue could be in the earliest translations of the Bible, which follow the same pattern and translate Nephilim as gigantes, which, by the way, is where we get our word for giants. So, there we have it. I find that reading the texts in their original language really reveals a lot about ancient texts like the Bible. The New Testament, especially the book of Revelations, has some really wacky creatures, like dragons and creatures covered entirely with eyes, perhaps a topic for a future video. Either way, I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're new here, subscribe.
Y'all can't everything around me. Dollar bill, y'all.
Return the